Sorry for the slight delay as I set up the captions. They should be working now, so if you go ahead and click the little CC bar at the bottom of your screen, it should give you all the caption options. Feel free to keep introducing yourself in the chat box so we can see where everybody is coming from and all the organizations that you are representing today. My name is Shirley. I am with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. I am here to kind of coordinate and facilitate today's webinar. I'm joined by Nathan Naik Shara, who will be your presenter today. A couple of housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded and it will be available on our website for later viewing and sharing. Your names, what you say in the chat box and all that will not appear in the recording, but even so, be mindful of if you're posting any sensitive or private information in the chat box, because that will be available to anybody who is here on the webinar today. As we go through the webinar, or as Nathan does, feel free to post your comments, your questions, reflections, experiences, anything like that in the chat box, respond to each other and all that. The chat box does seem to default to all panelists only, so you might want to change the option so that your comment is going to all panelists and attendees so that everybody can hear you. I will be here today during the webinar to assist with any technology related issues or any logistical issues. We will leave some time for question and answer at the end so that Nathan can address any content related questions that you have. It's nice to see you all here. So Zoom, everybody is, I'm sure, way more familiar with Zoom nowadays than you ever wanted to be. I think it's pretty straightforward. You have the chat box, the Q&A box. Feel free to leave your questions in either. If you have any questions, you can click my name in the participants, the panelists list, and send a message directly to me if you have any specific questions for me. I will be following up after the webinar with materials, slides, and recordings. Gonna find my controls here. Okay. Oh, so I did that. We do not have interpretation in the webinar today, but we have been taking a deep dive into our resources and our outreach to see where we can incorporate more language access. So if you have a request for language interpretation for this webinar or translation for any materials, go ahead and send them to me and we will try to get that fulfilled as we can. A little bit about the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. We are a national resource center on gender violence affecting the Asian and Pacific Islander community in the US. We are not a direct service agency, but we work with direct service agencies that serve Asian and Pacific Islander survivors. We work with law enforcement. We work with judges, lawyers, educators, folks all across the board, anybody who is working to end violence in API communities. And we do that by providing training, like this webinar here today, technical assistance, consultation, thought partnership, resources, materials, just anything that is helpful to build the capacity of different folks who are working with Asian and Pacific Islander survivors and communities. You can see a little bit about what we do on this slide here. And you can always visit our website, which I'll leave in the chat box at some point. So today, our presenter is here with us today. His name is Nathan Naik Shara. We have had the pleasure of working with Nathan several times over the past year past years on this topic. He is a educator and organizer and does a lot of great work on this topic in this community. As you can see from this description here, he spent over 15 years engaged in grassroots anti-violence organizing. So it's always a great experience for myself to speak with and learn from Nathan. I think you guys are in store for a great session today. So Nathan will introduce himself a little bit more, I think. I will be here in the chat box. Feel free to get in touch with me. Other than that, I'm going to turn it over to Nathan.
Thanks, Shirley. Well, welcome everyone. Again, my name is Nathan Naik Shara. I'm really happy to get to be with you all today. This webinar really grew out of a roundtable that the API Institute on Gender-Based Violence held in September 2019. And it's great to see the names of programs and all of your names rolling into the chat. And I'm seeing some familiar names and people who are also part of that roundtable. So please feel free to add your wisdom into the conversation. As Shirley mentioned, I've been doing anti-violence work for about the last 15 years. My first jobs, paid and unpaid, were as a volunteer coordinator in domestic violence programs and then an advocate. And I went on to become a trauma therapist and an educator. A lot of my work now is both with survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence, and also increasingly working with people who have caused harm. And most of that work really over all of those years has been in API immigrant and refugee communities, as well as in lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, gender nonconforming communities, and especially focusing on those intersections, which is really the kind of theme and topic for today. So I'm really glad to have been invited by the Institute to share and be with you all. And Shirley, if we could go to the next slide, I'd love to just share a little bit about where we're headed. So our agenda for today is really to provide some framing, definitions, and context for the experience of Asian and Pacific Islander LGBTQ survivors of gender-based violence. And just in planning for this session, I know we found ourselves just in the magnitude of that set of acronyms. There's just a lot of letters in there and a lot of experiences that that intersection really points to and speaks to. So we're going to take some time to sort of tease those apart and really map the landscape of who we're talking about in this conversation, and then really highlight some of the particular barriers and also strengths of these communities, and ways that the anti-violence movement and programs addressing gender-based violence could increase the effectiveness of our advocacy for LGBTQ API survivors. So breaking down those concepts and then talking more about some of the barriers, and then really lifting up some of the lessons and the conversations from this roundtable, again, which happened last September. We'll also be sharing links to a report that emerged out of that roundtable. So you're welcome to dig into that after this call. And then we'll be ending with some recommendations for advocates and for programs addressing gender-based violence, and we'll have a chunk of time towards the end for Q&A. I will say, please add your questions to the chat along the whole time. You don't need to save them till the end. Shirley will also be tracking the chat, and we'll be bringing those questions in towards the end, but please just add them in as we go. Can we have the next slide, please? So a little bit on the goals for this webinar. Really at a foundational level, we want to offer some basic terminology to keep understanding who LGBTQ communities are and include. Many of the programs I know around the API Institute are doing culturally specific gender-based violence work, and we really wanted to kind of focus in on the experience of LGBTQ members of those communities whose experiences often can go invisible even within culturally specific programs that maybe aren't focused on this particular intersection of identities or oppressions. We also want to offer a framework for understanding how LGBTQ people's experiences are part of gender-based violence. Sometimes the conversation about gender-based violence really focuses on women's experience of men's violence, and part of what I'm hoping to leave people with is a framework that really understands the experiences of queer and trans and gender nonconforming survivors as intimately linked with the experiences of non-trans women. I also want to identify barriers that are particular to kind of each of these communities, API people and communities and individuals and LGBTQ people, and then what are the specific barriers that people experience trying to access culturally specific services and supports, highlighting the needs for gender-based violence advocates and culturally specific organizations to really be proactive about serving LGBTQ members of your communities, and then offer some recommendations for integrating this lens into survivor advocacy and into your own analysis and thinking about gender-based violence. So that's sort of where we're headed. We can go to the next slide. So really to start, I want to say just a little bit about who we mean by Asian and Pacific Islander communities. And many of you probably know that the API Institute has really gathered a pretty incredible set of resources really about the experiences of API communities and the impacts of gender-based violence within them. The Institute uses the term Asian and Pacific Islander to include all people of Asian, Asian American, or Pacific Islander ancestry who trace their origins to the countries, states, jurisdictions, and or the diasporas of those geographic regions. And I've added these bullet pointed on here, but including Central Asia, East Asia, Hawaii, and the Pacific Islands, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and West Asia. So a huge, huge territory that encompasses many, many groups of people, cultures, histories, lineages, social conditions. This is not a monolithic identity, and in many ways we can understand the construction of Asian and Pacific Islander as really in a US context, that this race category has emerged. And then we know that Asian and Pacific Islander experiences overlap with and intersect with every other social group membership, including socioeconomic class, migration status, gender, disability, age, religion, and others. So in this conversation, as we're talking about API as a shorthand, this is really the wide swath of communities and people who are included in that. And I guess just to keep grounding this more specifically, that could include everyone from a third generation 55-year-old Japanese American woman working as a nonprofit administrator, or a 24-year-old Syrian refugee woman who has 3 young children, or a 6-year-old granddaughter of Hmong refugees from Laos. Like the range of who this means is very wide, and the needs of API communities are quite diverse, which I think will be a central theme and through line through this conversation. Next slide. So in some ways, similarly, the term LGBTQ is also an acronym that encompasses a huge breadth of identities and experiences. And I know I've rattled off those letters a number of times already, but LGBTQ is an acronym for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. Sometimes the Q is also used to represent questioning, or people who are not yet certain of their sexual orientation. There's also other versions of this acronym that add on additional letters, such as I for intersex identified people, or A for allies. If this is a newer term, I would definitely encourage you to look at some of we'll be sharing some more resources after the webinar, but there's a wealth of definitions pretty readily available on the internet. And these terms are in kind of constant evolution, but for the sake of this conversation, we'll be using LGBTQ in this way. And the acronym describes both people's sexual orientation and their gender identity. And like the term API, LGBTQ is a pretty broad umbrella term, which has also been used as a political identity to build power among these groups around shared experiences of marginalization, targeting, violence, and oppression, specifically on the basis of gender and sexual orientation. And again, LGBTQ experiences intersect and overlap with other social group memberships like class, disability, national origin, language. And really what we're going to keep looking at is the overlaps between these these big circles. Next slide. So if we were all together in a room, this would be a moment where I'd invite you to turn to someone near you and have a brief conversation. And since we aren't, I'm just going to ask you to take out a piece of paper or just open up something that you can take some notes in on your, on your device. And we're just going to take a few moments to be with a couple questions. And the first one is, when is the first time that you remember knowing that there was a sexual orientation other than heterosexual? And I'm just going to pause for a few moments for you to jot down some of those earliest memories, or the earliest one you can remember. Was that something that you heard about in your family or in your community? Was it something that you saw on TV? Was it something you encountered in a book? And you're also welcome to share in the chat if you choose, but really just in whatever way works for you in this moment. Go ahead and identify yourself for yourself. When's the first time you remember knowing this? And then what do you remember learning about lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or transgender, or queer people? And it could be that you were just hearing about one of those letters. And from what sources did you learn this information? Was this a positive set of associations, a critical one, a shameful one? And then finally, how did you learn that you were expected to be heterosexual? And really, regardless of how you might identify now, what were some of the messages or the sources of that expectation? Or if that wasn't an expectation, inside of your family or the immediate networks you grew up in, where did you encounter that expectation embodied in the community or the culture or the society that you were growing up inside of? We'll just take another few moments here. All right, next slide. So the last circle that I want to talk about, which really will build on that set of early reflections, is defining gender-based violence. And in talking about survivors of gender-based violence, again, in the context of the API Institute, some of the, well, I'll start by saying the United Nations defines gender-based violence as any act that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion, or arbitrary deprivations of liberty, whether occurring in public or private life. And some of the forms of gender-based violence that the API Institute works with and addresses include forced marriage, dating abuse, and sexual assault among youth and teens, domestic violence, child sexual abuse, elder abuse, LGBTQ intimate partner violence, familial violence, sexual violence, trafficking, and others. And again, while gender-based violence is largely male pattern violence, it can include the victimization of women, girls, men, boys, adolescents, and lesbian, gay, trans, gender nonconforming people. And I want to just dig into that a little bit more because I think often our conversations about gender tend to be very focused on men and women without necessarily unpacking even that term gender, which is very relevant when we're talking about LGBTQ experiences. Next slide. So I want to offer a definition of patriarchy, and I'm seeing in the chat that someone just offered a binary gender system, which is exactly what I want to speak about here. So just to start, one way that I'll be talking about patriarchy in this conversation is that patriarchy is a structure of beliefs and practices which are institutional, cultural, and individual. And really within any system of oppression, there's first the idea that one group is superior than another. And then that idea gets baked into or embedded in the institutions of a society and then justifies interpersonal mistreatment, abuse, violence that comes to be also internalized at the level of individuals. So when we're talking about patriarchy, there's a whole structure that really sweeps across each of those layers. And one of the fundamental things that patriarchy establishes is a binary gender system of two distinct genders that get called men and women. And within that system, which really creates these two boxes or these two options, men are granted power and privilege at the expense of women, transgender, and gender variant people. And I think it's really important to just underscore that last piece because often sexism or patriarchy gets spoken about really in terms of the benefits that men are granted at the expense of women, and women, transgender, gender variant, gender nonconforming people are often not named in the conversation about patriarchy. So I want to, again, just dig into this a little bit more. We can go to the next slide here. Some of you may have seen this activity before that's often a part of kind of 40-hour domestic violence volunteer trainings or intro staff trainings, but really digging into the foundations of binary gender and patriarchal gender norms. So I'm going to start just by talking about these terms, woman and man, and often in this activity, and we can just bring up the first box here, we'll start by talking about what are the expectations of what it means to be a woman, to act like a lady, to be a good girl within a particular community, culture, or society. And if we are doing this in kind of a dominant US cultural view, we could fill this in one way. And if we really had this conversation inside of any particular community or any particular subgrouping within this Asian and Pacific Islander umbrella, we might fill in this set of descriptors differently. But generally, in every community, there's a set of expectations about how a woman's body should be or is. There are cultural standards of beauty and femininity. There are areas that a woman is expected to be competent, and perhaps areas that fall outside of that, right? Things that women are not supposed to do or not supposed to know about. There's usually a range of emotional expression that's considered womanly or feminine. Assumptions about caregiving, about wanting to give care, about being skillful at that in certain ways, and then a whole set of roles and expectations around sex and sexuality, right? And again, we could spend a long time fleshing this out or even talking about the particular community or cultural context that each of you is working in, what's inside of this box. And then we could also spend a very long time, I imagine, talking about what women and girls are called when they transgress this box or when they step outside of it. And I'm not going to ask folks to put this in the chat. It tends to be a very, very painful list of slurs and words, often very much sexualizing, degrading, dehumanizing, and really implying both a lack of intelligence, a lack of capability, and really the list, no matter how large the piece of paper, tends to spill over beyond the edges. And some of you may have done this activity and witnessed that, but it's a very painful and very quick set of terms that we're usually able to produce. And then on the other side of this box, we could also start to name what is done to girls and women when they step outside of this box. And again, this becomes a long list of particular acts and moments of gender-based violence. One way we can think of each of these lists, imagined though they might be in this moment, is as fists or as forces that push and pressure people to fit back into this set of expectations, whether or not that is innate to who they are. And so the construction of woman becomes this very, very small, tight, constricting space. And some people will also talk about this more as a web than as a box, that many of the messages are actually totally contradictory. So don't be too fat, but don't be too thin. Don't be short, but don't be too tall. And that there's an impossibility to actually, that really nobody can ultimately fit inside of this box. On the other side, in this sort of column called man, right, we have the same sort of set of expectations, but usually this looks and sounds very different than what's expected of women. And then same thing, we could talk about what boys or men get called when they step outside of this box. And oftentimes these words that are used to sort of force and police men and boys back into expectations of manhood and masculinity are feminizing words. So when boys and men step outside, they're called girls or sissies or don't be a woman about this, right? And we can see that just the implication of being called feminine is considered an insult. And then again, on the other side, there's a whole set of acts, violence that get done to boys and men when they step outside of this box. And I say that both to, I think, underscore that these forms of gender-based violence happen to all people, right, across a gender spectrum, or I guess maybe to be more specific, gender-based violence doesn't only happen to women, but it can also be a force that's enacted upon men. And there's a whole kind of a set of people or whole population of people and experiences that don't fit at all inside of these boxes. Again, we could say that nobody ultimately fits inside of the box, and for some of us, it may be a little bit of an easier fit than for others. And when we're talking about the experiences of many LGBTQ people, what we're talking about are people who often are at the very forefront of those policing forces to get shoved back into boxes that do not fit. And I think one thing I'll also say here about patriarchal gender norms is, in many ways, a baby's born and the first question is often, is the baby a boy or a girl? And we could say what's being used to determine that usually is looking at the baby's genitals. So again, we could look at this top line in these boxes of body type. And if the baby has a penis, they're going to be placed in this box called man with this whole set of expectations. And if they don't, they'll be put in this second box called woman. And we'll have this whole other set of expectations that are in many ways very counter to the man box. But as I think I'm always struck by, many of the things that are considered feminine or womanly, like cooking or sewing, if you get to a certain level of status, it becomes a man's job again. Like many of the top chefs in the world, or the most renowned and well-paid tailors, are men. So there's, again, a kind of paradox. And some of the rules or the logic of binary gender is, if that baby, let's say, has a penis, is considered male, he'll be expected to become a man to present in a masculine way, or really conforming to this set of norms in the box, and to be attracted to women. And if the baby is assigned female, she'll be expected to be a woman, to be a girl who grows into a woman, to present herself in a feminine way, and to be attracted to men. And what that kind of system or logic doesn't account for is the possibility that people might have traits or feelings or experiences that mix these categories. So the assumption is that all of these traits are locked together and all of these traits are locked together, and there's no mixing or matching, that you have to be one or the other, and you can't be neither, and you definitely can't be both, that you don't get to choose which to be, and you can't change from one to the other, and ultimately that the man box is better. And I don't say those like they're true, but as sort of the foundational logic of a binary gender system. And then we know that many people's experiences really violate those rules or those norms, and that makes them especially susceptible to gender-based violence, which is really why we're kind of honing in on this piece here. But next slide. So again, while the definition of the boxes costs, I think, arguably all of us, I think there's a growing movement and conversation around healthier masculinities or less toxic masculinities, really lifting up the consequences to boys and men of this man box. We can also see that the consequences land disproportionately upon women, transgender, and gender nonconforming people. And all of that work is important. And again, in making those lists, the lists of what girls and women are called when they step outside of those boxes or what's done to them are always longer than the lists that groups make around the man box. And then we can look at any of the statistics around sexual violence and physical violence according to gender and see that same disparity. I think it's also very important to say that anybody, regardless of their gender, can participate in enforcing the boundaries of each box. And I think this can be one of the paradoxes or the dilemmas for our movements addressing gender-based violence, is that many people, and certainly in conversations about LGBTQ people, many people will also experience policing of gender or gender roles or expectations from other women or from other people who share identity, including oppressed or marginalized identity. So one of the ways we can understand that is that these systems have gotten internalized. Sexism, homophobia, transphobia are embodied in all of us. And each of those words describes different patterns of gender-based violence or of enforcing patriarchy. So I want to tease each of those out a little bit more. Can we go to the next slide? So homophobia as a term, again, there are many definitions for each of these. I'm offering some that really speak to this analysis of patriarchy and of gender-based violence, but homophobia can be understood as the irrational fear of love, affection, and erotic behavior between people of the same gender, expressed as negative feelings, attitudes, actions, and institutional discrimination against those perceived as non-heterosexual, often on the basis of gender expression or presentation. And I think that part is very important. I worked for many years in Seattle doing education around sex, gender, and sexuality with schools and school districts and other public sector settings that were dealing with discrimination and bullying. And there was a study at one point on incidences of homophobic violence among middle and high school students. And one of the things that these researchers found that I was very struck by was that in every 5 incidences of homophobic bullying or instances of students being targeted or physically assaulted with homophobic slurs or being targeted in ways that explicitly named sexuality, 4 out of 5 of those young people actually identified as heterosexual, but something about the way that they were expressing their gender, how they were being a boy or how they were showing up in their gender was getting targeted or called gay. And I think it really speaks to the intersection between gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation and the ways that these things have gotten collapsed into one another. and often homophobic violence is really on the basis of gender expression or presentation. We can go to the next slide. And then the term transphobia can be understood as the irrational fear of those who are perceived to break or blur stereotypical gender roles. And again, this can be expressed as negative feelings, attitudes, actions, as well as institutional discrimination. One example that I think can just be instructive is really just the fact of men's bathrooms and women's bathrooms, which obviously has been, a much talked about dynamic of institutional transphobia. If those are the only two options, or if the binary system is built into the literal structures and environments, it's very difficult to find an option for anyone who doesn't fit within that existing set of constructs. And again, within violence or harm or oppression that we can think of as transphobia, it's often directed at those perceived as expressing or presenting gender in a transgressive way, whether or not someone identifies as transgender or gender nonconforming. Next slide. So I've been talking a little bit about this intersection of, well, particularly the circle of LGBTQ, and I want to start naming a little bit more the places where these different circles or buckets overlap. So really this webinar, this conversation is focused on the center circle where the star is, but we'll be talking about each of these intersections in turn, just because there's so much within each one. So we can go to the next slide. So as many of you know, depending on where you're situated or who your program is working with, the barriers to survivors of gender-based violence are extensive, right? Whether we're talking about limited access to resources, be it specific resources around surviving, or generally economic insecurity, lack of access to housing or to healthcare or to clean food and water. There's also the impacts of surviving violence, including shame, confusion, fear of rejection from community, displacement, right? Losing housing or security, the dynamics of victim blaming, the isolation, stigma that can come with disclosing abuse, the potential loss of family or community, and then just the traumatic impacts of violence. So really just focusing on that circle of survivors of gender-based violence is no small set of barriers. And I know many of you spend your time and your days really working to increase access and to decrease the stigma for people in this circle. And then if I kind of hop over to this upper left circle of Asian and Pacific Islander communities, some of the particular barriers we can also count on include racism, xenophobia, barriers around immigration status, language access, and just all of the ways that programs and services of every kind can be really unavailable or inaccessible completely to communities based on language. Many communities uphold and maintain traditional gender roles, which map very much onto the boxes we were just talking about. There can be a lack of economic opportunities, closed doors for people to be able to do work in sectors they may have trained in their home country, or being denied access to training and education. Islamophobia and other forms of oppression and stigma based on people's faith and tradition, as well as a long history of and set of dynamics around the traumas of war, escape, refugee settlement, the kind of push and pull factors of global migration that often create Asian and Pacific Islander communities in the ways that we understand them, certainly in a US context as well as globally. And then finally, going to the upper right, some of the particular barriers that we're talking about around LGBTQ communities include what we were just naming: homophobia, transphobia, lack of economic and employment opportunities, particularly for people whose gender transgresses sort of traditional binary roles or norms, familial rejection and abuse, a high level of homelessness, isolation, lack of resources from family and community support networks as a result of being lesbian or gay, bisexual, trans, etc., religious ostracization, and then very few legal protections for partners and parents, as well as limited access to healthcare, or even if people have access to healthcare services, limited training, or often a high level of harm experienced in seeking help. So no small set of barriers, and I know I'm rattling these off, but really in the day-to-day details of each of these experiences, just a world of pain. And then when we're really zeroing in on the overlap among these circles, we're really putting that whole set of lists together, and that can take many different flavors and forms depending on someone's individual experience. But part of the conversation about intersectionality is really looking at the ways that barriers stack. And I've often heard privilege described as walking through a door. If we have privilege, the door just opens for us, or we turn the handle and it opens, and it's easy to not even notice that the door is there. But if the door is locked to us, or if it's, there's a do not cross set of caution tape, or there's a big bar across it, or an armed guard in front of it, we become very, very aware of the door. And I think this list really starts to point to some of the many layers and barriers that LGBTQ survivors are encountering and facing. I can go to the next slide. One of the things that I also want to lift up, and particularly for those of you who are working in culturally specific gender-based violence, domestic violence, sexual assault programs, is that in many of our communities, the norms around gender and around tradition, even when we have feminist values, can fall into homophobic assumptions that family violence against LGBTQ people is sort of inevitable. Well, of course, that person's parents are upset or even raging because it's a concern that somebody's LGBTQ. And I think it's a place where, some of this analysis, where we can kind of leverage our feminist values and practice to really start to unpack that. Often what we see is that some of the most lasting impacts or hurts that LGBTQ people describe are in the context of family, or in the context of their close community. And as a result of that kind of faulty assumption, when violence is committed against LGBTQ people by family members, it's often not considered violence at all. And there can be a reluctance to classify harm or violence perpetrated by family members as abuse. So the kind of a huge swath of the context of violence that LGBTQ people experience often goes sort of under the radar, even amongst many of us who hold an analysis of gender-based violence as central to our work. And I'll just say specifically, some of the impacts of familial violence that many LGBTQ people describe include rejection, condemnation, eviction from the family home, physical violence, forced marriage, and for many queer and trans people, they would say the most painful or traumatizing experiences of gender-based violence in their lifetime happened from the people who they most expected to care from and care for. Next slide. A little bit more on community violence, because I think, again, for any of you in culturally specific programs or doing work inside of API communities, especially, really integrating an understanding of homophobia and transphobia into how you're talking about gender-based violence can be a huge shift. And one of the things that really struck me at the roundtable of queer and trans API people doing work around gender-based violence, and this is something I've noticed for many years in the field, is many people are doing and building work to address homophobia and transphobia within culturally specific programs. Perhaps more so, and I say this really anecdotally, doing specific work around API experience inside of LGBTQ programs. And I think part of what I want to say about that is there is such a depth and richness to the community norms and practices. There can be so much resilience in culturally specific organizations, and then for LGBTQ people to have to go outside of community in order to be seen or supported around experiences of violence related to homophobia or transphobia can create a very painful split, which was a thread of conversation in the roundtable that I'll be speaking about more in a moment. But what we see is that patriarchal community norms and leaders can really ultimately condone abuse instead of preventing gender violence, especially if there isn't an active stance or commitment to disrupting homophobia and transphobia. And many API survivors, certainly LGBTQ survivors, but really regardless of sexual orientation, contend with community-generated barriers, such as shaming, silencing, victim blaming, or rejecting survivors who speak up and seek help. And for many LGBTQ survivors and API communities, as I'm saying, homophobic community norms really add to the fear and isolation. So part of what's on this slide is a really amazing campaign that the National Queer API Alliance did a few years back called Family is Still Family, featuring parents and children from a number of different Asian and Pacific Islander communities, really talking about fundamentally parents saying, I love my gay child, or I love my queer child. And this campaign was available in multiple languages. We'll include links with the slides, but some of this kind of proactive messaging at the level of programs can do a huge amount to let LGBTQ community members know that your culturally specific program is a place that welcomes gay, lesbian, trans, bi, queer people, and particularly people who are surviving, whether in an intimate partnership or in the context of family. So next slide. I think some of this I've spoken to with the overlapping circles, but really again focusing on that very center overlap. I want to name some of the particular barriers that exist for people in that intersection. One can really be a lack of language with which to self-identify. So not even having words in one's native tongue or in one's community context to understand our own experience or to claim a positive self-identity, which can then make it very difficult to seek or find other people who share that identity or experience. A dynamic of LGBTQ identity being seen as Western or as a rejection of culture. So communities saying, oh, you've become American, or you've become like them, rather than being able to integrate or hold that somebody is a member of their community and also LGBTQ. Many API queer and trans people and survivors describe feeling caught between cultures and having to go outside of their community context to seek acceptance of their LGBTQ identity. But in that, facing a loss of cultural connection, relationship, identity, lineage, and feeling a somewhat irreconcilable contradiction between being seen and dignified for an aspect of their identity, but at the expense of another. And really the theme of wholeness, or of getting to be one's whole self, keeps emerging in conversations, and certainly in the roundtable last September. Isolation, really just feeling that there's no place to go, or finding any of the many barriers to having one's experience reflected or being able to seek resources. a lack of legal status and or protections, and that could be related to immigration, related to parenthood, related to parental rights, with many of those rights denied, both around immigrant and refugee status, as well as being a queer or trans parent whose parental rights may or may not be legally legitimized. A fear of outing, limited access to employment, housing, and healthcare. I'm not going to read all of these, but there's many more. Lack of positive representations, and then all of the many ways that people experience these multiple barriers and oppressions. For the next slide. So I want to just share a little bit about the roundtable last September. So this was a gathering of I'm not remembering the exact number now, but Asian and Pacific Islander LGBT identified people who have worked in the fields of gender-based violence, of ending domestic violence and sexual assault for many years. And it was a relatively multi-generational cohort, and really a rich set of conversations over a couple days. And one of the things that we spent some time with, I imagine many of you have probably seen the API Institute's lifetime spiral of gender-based violence, which really maps some of the many different moments over the life course where gender-based violence can occur. And that spiral has been used in a lot of different contexts to talk about within South Asian communities, within Hmong community, within Chinese American communities. What is the spiral, or what are some of the ways that gender-based violence is embedded and embodied in a particular cultural set of practices or a particular set of community norms? And in engaging with that spiral, we started to really talk about what are some of those moments in the life course of API LGBTQ people. And I think one of the things that emerged very loud and very clear from early in the conversation is how unwieldy in many ways all these, like this whole Venn diagram is, and that actually in trying to generalize to the entire umbrella of API plus the entire umbrella of LGBTQ, there's a great deal of specificity that gets missed, and actually opportunities for advocacy and outreach and policy. And one of the real kind of asks that came very loudly from the conversations was the desire to both disaggregate all the data to say, well, no, what about in this particular community, in this particular cultural context? What is the way that sexual assault is happening among young people, and how is that a part of the cultural norms or the way that patriarchy is happening? And then also to be able to put all of the data and research together to advocate for the needs and concerns of API LGBTQ survivors as a whole. And I think often we fall into one or another kind of column of either getting very small in projects or focus to say, well, this is what's happening inside of this very specific context, but it often being hard to leverage resources or to advocate for broader scale change from that place, or going so wide and so generic that that's very hard to make things applicable. But in that, really one of the themes was also in talking about all these barriers and talking about the kind of suffering and the many moments in the life course when API LGBTQ people experience targeting and violence and harm. One of the things that can get lost is all of the resilience and celebration and the ways that all of us around the table had seen examples of community members really supporting one another in healing and in finding positive identity around being LGBTQ, and finding a great deal of pride in that, or finding resilience and protection from some of these gender norms in having community around those identities. People also really spoke about, and I think I saw someone name something along these lines in the in the chat about kind of pre-colonial expansiveness around gender expectations or practices and traditions that actually really run counter to some of what is much more associated with the West or with colonization and imperialism. And in coming to a more positive self-identity as LGBTQ people, people starting to seek and find more in their own lineages to celebrate, which really started to repair some of that sense of queerness or transness being seen as Western or being seen as American or other. One of the other things that emerged, again, kind of talking about that spiral, was the desire to map an alternate spiral of all the moments of resilience and healing and coming together that API LGBTQ communities have expressed and could find if there were more supports, resources, affirmation to really uplift and celebrate the resilience and strength of our communities. And in that, an image that really came forward was of, rather than a spiral of violence, to really talk about a whole whirlwind of healing and resilience, which is where the title for this session came from. And there's a little bit more about that also in the roundtable report, which Shirley is going to share links to after the session, and I believe also in the chat. So we can go to the next slide here. A couple things, again, coming out of that conversation that I wanted to offer as we're thinking about how to shift practices, but also really how to shift paradigms. Historically, a lot of the conversation about LGBTQ experience, including within API communities and culturally specific organizations, tends to get very, very tangled up in why are people gay or lesbian? Why are people bisexual? Why are people transgender? What are queer and trans people's lives like? What do they do? Or even really fixating on all of the harm that is done to our communities. And how do LGBTQ people feel about themselves? Often questions of, you know, are you comfortable with your identity, or what do your parents think of you, or have you told your family? And part of what we really want to advocate for, encourage, fight for is a different paradigm that actually asks some fundamentally different questions. So rather than why are people LGBTQ, asking what are the obstacles to LGBTQ people's safety and survival? What limits our dignity and equality in a particular community or in society at large? What does discrimination look like for queer and trans people in our community? And again, I really want to specifically speak to folks who are here from culturally specific community organizations. Like what are the ways that discrimination shows up explicitly or implicitly? And then I think probably most important, how do we remove the barriers that prevent LGBTQ survivors from accessing support? How do we dismantle the systems of oppression that target women and LGBTQ people? And I want to offer a few specific recommendations and questions. We can go to the next slide here, and then I'll pause for some Q&A. I know there's a lot in here. So the first is really posing this question to all of you and really to your program, which is, does our organization have an explicit commitment to serving LGBTQ survivors in our community? And, you know, I think really it's a yes or no question, though there might be texture to it. And if not, why not? And, you know, I think there are many real answers that can come forward around this, about resources, about capacity, about attention. I know most programs are already stretched thin around all of those things. And without this commitment, what we see is the gender-based violence of homophobia, of transphobia, and of patriarchy ends up playing out, and we end up being our programs end up being a part of that, or continuing that cycle in our communities. We can go to the next bullet point here. One just very concrete suggestion to keep looking at how your program can shift towards more more access, more integration of LGBTQ members of your community, are to review all the places where your organization's presence is visible or felt. So that could be your physical space, your online presence, all of your printed outreach materials, your hotline scripts, your HR and personnel policies, and really look at them with the lens of what are the spoken and unspoken messages to LGBTQ people in your community. And that could be that the communication is you don't exist, right? That there's actually no mention or nothing that presences or lets people know that they're seen, included, part of the conversation, or that services would be available to them. But really taking that kind of lens or that view on every aspect of your organization. The next one is really asking, are you prepared to meet the needs of a community member who's surviving same-sex intimate partner violence? And I really want to lift up the National Institute on LGBTQ domestic violence for really kind of codifying and gathering a pretty remarkable collection of resources on LGBTQ domestic violence, which is going to be included in the resource list. But really, if your program were to get a call from a gay male survivor who's experiencing abuse in his partnership with another man, and called your program, let's say seeking shelter, what would your program do? Do you have a response? And some of your programs might already be equipped to navigate that. Other programs might go, wow, we have no way to do that. But I think that this set of questions could also ask around trans survivors, but really starting to go, it's okay if the answer is no, but if we assume that at some point that will happen, could happen, should happen, that it would actually be a positive sign if someone felt they could reach out to us. What do we need to do, kind of tracking that back to be prepared for that moment. And then finally, one of the resources I'll be sharing is an organizational audit to really look in more detail than I've laid out here at all of your programs, policies, and practices to see how are we doing, or are we set up to meet the needs of LGBTQ survivors, but really by when can you complete that audit? And I would encourage you to really take a moment to think about how soon or how urgently you could commit to taking this lens to your program. So this is an initial set of some suggestions, and again, there'll be more in the report and in the resources, but I want to just take a little time here to pause for questions. And Shirley, maybe I'll pass it to you to lift some up.
Thank you, Nathan. This is Shirley again. So like I said, feel free to leave questions or reflections and things like that in the chat box, or in the Q&A panel is also fine. Let me just look through and see what some of the outstanding questions are. We have one question in the question and answer box. It's two questions. This person says, I'm a queer API Pakistani Muslim service provider in gender-based violence. The first question is, do you have any tips on how people within the community can hold themselves to certain practices or continuously improve?
And I'm gonna guess in this, and we could also feel free to bring you on to clarify, but like certain practices to continuously improve on meeting the needs of LGBTQ survivors, or addressing patriarchy or kind of cultural norms within a community. I can speak a bit to both, but feel free to add in here if there's more one side or the other of that you're asking into. I think one of the things that really comes up a lot around doing work inside of culturally specific communities, really any community, is what are the kind of community norms that either incentivize or punish shifting cultural practices. And, I think for any of you who do community engagement work or who are really trying to kind of chip away at patriarchal gender norms that may be embedded in the communities you're working in, it's slow work. And the more people are engaged in kind of rewarding and celebrating different versions of masculinity or celebrating LGBTQ people within a community, I think many gender-based violence programs are sort of seen as that and can experience sort of the community pushback for naming the unnameable or speaking what's not meant to be spoken. But I think this kind of question about how do we hold ourselves to an ethic or a practice of continuously improving requires having more people and more eyes on what we're doing, and really creating a culture that encourages, celebrates, rewards accountability in some way, even if it's a really small container in which we're practicing that. I think that's kind of a starting place. And again, please feel free to clarify if there's more to kind of what you're asking. Maybe I'll just say a little bit on your second question, as you're maybe sharing that in, which I see as about tips of working as a sole queer service provider, and being in an organization that's newer to queer and trans inclusivity within DV programming. I think the first thing I'll say is it makes so much sense that it would be heavy lifting. I think for any of us being the only, right, whether that's the only queer and trans person or the only API person in a predominantly white organization trying to forward a conversation about racial justice, for example, there is just a weight to trying to shift something that's so much bigger than you. And I think one of the things that I have definitely seen is essential is to figure out where and whom you're in that struggle with, even if they're not inside of your same program. And that could be other people inside of the kind of community around your program. But really, I think some of how I hold it is the bigger the sphere we're trying to change, the more people are required to change it. And there's certainly a lot that we can do as an individual inside of a program, and we need to have other people alongside us, whether that's formally trying to shift the culture or practice inside of an organization, or even just to be able to share some of your frustrations with, or to get affirmation and support about some of the challenges you're experiencing, and be able to feel seen and heard and gotten enough to be able to sort of get back in and try the next piece. But if any of us are chipping away at a struggle in total isolation, I think everything we know from gender-based violence work about the toxicity of isolation applies to us too, of trying to change something without support. But I feel for you in that position, and really hope perhaps there are other people also on this call who might resonate, that could potentially be people to connect with about this very thing.
There's a little bit more context added to the first question, in that the same participant who says that to work with others, they've had to unpack their own norms about being a queer API person, not wanting to capitalize their emotional growth, but wanting to improve to serve others. Do you have any self-care or educational or boundary practices?
I see. Thank you for clarifying. That's really helpful. I guess what I'll say is I imagine that regardless of identity, there are probably many of us on this call who could resonate with the fact that the more we face into the impacts of gender-based violence, or being with survivors, for those of you who are doing direct service work, the more we end up confronting places where we're not totally worked out around something, or where some bias that we've internalized either about another group or about ourselves has gotten has gotten embodied. And there is a kind of, I think it's why the anti-violence movement has really held such an ethic of ongoing learning and continued training, because we know that the details are really where so much of oppression and cycles of violence end up perpetuating or not. And I mean, I think to more specifically to what you're asking, I mean, I think, I shared in my introduction, I've, for the last 14 years now, been affiliated with an organization called Generative Somatics, which is one set of practices and approaches for really building the kind of internal emotional capacity to have clear boundaries, to care for ourselves. And I think many people in anti-violence work are finding that we need some kind of practice, whether that's, for some people, meditation or yoga or qigong or other things. I think really identifying for yourself, what do you do or what do you find that helps bolster your internal sense of resource to be able to both keep being with the depth of pain that is in our field, but also to build the capacity to keep risking and stretching to fight for something else in the communities that we're part of and around us, especially when what we're fighting for is so countercultural to many of the communities we're in. I'm gonna pause there. I think there's a world in that question, but I appreciate you bringing it. Hopefully that's a starting place.
Thank you, Nathan, and everybody who's on this call today for doing this work and for taking what often ends up being the heavy lift and taking on the emotional burden of it all. It's not easy, as you said. There's a comment in the chat box. It's not really a question, but I think it's important to lift up. This participant says that their organization serves all survivors, LGBTQ inclusive, but the reporting is very low. Just wondering if you can speak to some of the, some of the reasons that, just LGBTQ survivors might not be showing up or requesting services.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's many layers, and I appreciate what you said here of, there can be many reasons why, and possibly also being in an API specific context can have its own particular barriers. I think a few things that I'll lift up, one really, I think this whole arc of conversation is really like, what have our programs also done to let people know that they can disclose, and in what context? I think oftentimes, even when LGBTQ people may be perceiving that it's okay or safe to come out to a program staff or to a volunteer within an organization, when it comes to filling out forms or identifying on paper, there's often a real, the whole kind of shadow of all of these barriers is present. And many times people will feel the need to say or do what they think is more likely to ensure that they continue to have access to services. I think there's also a question of do a programs, and it sounds like this might not be the case for you specifically, but I'll say more broadly, like, does your program have ways for people to self-identify and to presence that they are LGBTQ? Oftentimes, if someone isn't filling out forms directly themselves, or a staff member is filling out forms, people will presume or assume that someone is heterosexual, or that they're gender conforming, while someone's identity may or may not, that may or may not be true to someone's identity or experience. I think also, especially when we're speaking about the intersections of immigration enforcement and sexual orientation, there can be just a deeply embodied fear of being found out, or if people have, if there's tenuousness around their migration status, or being in the U.S. context, in the U.S., there can definitely be the kind of history or legacy of targeting or barriers for queer and trans people. And then I appreciate what you, Charlene, I'm not sure how you pronounce your name. I hope I'm saying it correctly. But this piece about creating brochures specifically and also demonstrating publicly that you're working with LGBTQ people and organizations, I think is huge. And I think a lot of programs could really take a page from that book of what makes it explicit. And then I think reporting is a complex terrain, and sometimes it can be helpful to be very, very explicit with participants or with clients about how different reports are used or how paperwork is going to be shared or reported on. And I'll say in some of the programs I've worked with, there's been very explicit forms or distinctions between this is, for a grant or for reporting, and this is for internal documentation, and then also really asking ourselves, what do we need to document, and what can be held sort of in organizational memory. Again, there's a lot to say on reporting, but I'll pause there.
Thank you, Nathan. Yeah, and this is something that we actually hear a lot from organizations where they're open to serving all survivors regardless of orientation or gender, but they find that there's few LGBTQ people or people who identify as LGBTQ coming to them. So it's a constant, self-reflection and self-audit of your program to analyze the ways that you're being inclusive and welcoming.
Thanks for that, Shirley.
Let me just see if there's no more questions at the moment. I know you have a couple of other slides.
Yeah. Happy to go to the next slide. So I wanted to just come back to this graphic and really speak to sort of the other side, right? From the spiral of violence more to the image of a whirlwind of healing, and to really lift up again in each of these kind of categories. What are some of the strengths, some of the resilience, some of the kind of protective factors that we can also really celebrate and uplift? Because sometimes in talking about the barriers or the harms that people are experiencing, it can inadvertently create a sort of pity or oh, that must be so hard, which isn't at all the intention, though we don't want to minimize the suffering. There's also so much that, some of you might have heard the term in kind of contrast with post-traumatic stress of post-traumatic growth. And so we'll move to the next slide, but I just wanted to offer sort of a counterpoint to the slide that we were with a little while ago. So again, if I start at the bottom with survivors of gender-based violence, and I imagine many of us on this call would include ourselves in this circle, one of the things that we see is that survivors are hugely represented in traditions of being of service, of contributing to social action, of being part of social movements, of helping others, and of investing our time, our attention, our love, our capacity into helping other people who have experienced or suffered some of what we may have lived. There's also really a very strong commitment often among survivors to ending, disrupting, and transforming cycles of violence and injustice. And again, I think those of you on this call are clearly enrolled and participating in that process. And I think even these questions that came up of kind of doing the self-work can be a process of unlearning and healing the impacts of gender-based violence and actually practicing something else instead. Dignified resistance to oppressive gender roles and norms. And again, this, I could say this around survivors of gender-based violence, many many people end up going on to claim competencies and skills and ways of being that are outside of that narrow box that we were taught to be in, and actually going, no, I'm going to be a different kind of man, or I'm going to learn skills that I'm not supposed to know how to do as a girl, right? But actually coming to a real sense of dignity in and rejection of or transgression of those norms and expectations. There's also just a huge amount, and any of you who do direct service work with survivors know that the resilience and resourcefulness of survivors is, I mean, just endlessly a place of kind of awe and admiration of what people are able to come up with in the course of surviving. And obviously that's sometimes skill born out of really conditions no one should ever have to be in, but no less worth celebrating. Compassion for other survivors, this idea of post-traumatic growth, or, you know, for those of us who have chosen to work with other survivors, you know, people often talk about secondary trauma, but we can also talk about secondary resilience, or the ways that it bolsters our own sense of hope or possibility to witness the strength of the human spirit. And then really coming to greater meaning and self-understanding. And I'll say, you know, as an advocate and as a therapist, one of the things that I really hear often is people saying, you know, I don't in any way wish that this had happened to me, right? Often in the context of sexual violence or family violence. But I can see that because it did, I made a whole set of life choices that I very easily could have not made. And I'm glad I did. Yeah. So some of the strength and resilience, just to lift up around survivors of gender-based violence. And then I'll speak some about API communities. And again, there's sort of a wealth of detail and differentiation among the communities that this circle contains, but a very, very deep, long lineage of cultural practice, of history. You know, I think many people have commented on kind of certainly the nation state of the US having a very sort of short history, which often disappears the long, long history of Indigenous life and contribution on these lands. But lineage and cultural practices, often very textured, intergenerational relationships within family and community, strong networks of community ties and faith institutions, sometimes connected to formal religion, sometimes not, an incredible wealth of linguistic diversity, and just many, many, many forms of community resilience. Right? And then, you know, if I hop over to speaking about LGBTQ communities, we could really talk about collective pride and resilience. I mean, it's, you know, no accident that sort of one of the oldest queer holidays is called Pride, but really asserting and affirming a positive self-identity at a collective scale. Again, dense networks of support, relationship, and mutual aid. And we could talk a lot about what are some of the skills or competencies that grow in response to oppression or to harm, but really we could see a lot of examples of very vibrant chosen family, financial support, and other forms of support circulating among LGBTQ communities. In many cases, different models for equitable divisions of labor between partners or between people who are parenting together. And, you know, some of you may have been exposed to the Gottman Institute, which does a lot of work on healthy relationships and couple dynamics. And, you know, one of their founders, John Gottman, really talks about many lesbian and gay couples being a couple hundred years ahead of heterosexual couples in models of equitability in the division of kind of labor in partnership. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't also sometimes harm and violence, but as a whole, there's a set of norms and practices that are a real source of teaching for many communities. And then finally, again, a really rich tradition of social activism, of participation in movement work and in really trying to shift and change the kind of oppressive forces and barriers that surround us. So very important to kind of celebrate and uplift. And just in our last couple minutes here, I want to talk a little bit about some of the resources that you all can follow up with if you're interested in learning more about some of what I've been sharing about here. So I mentioned already this organizational audit, which again comes out of the Northwest Network of Bi, Trans, Lesbian, and Gay Survivors of Abuse, which is based in Seattle. And all of these are hyperlinked. When we send out the slides following the session, you'll be able to access all of the links in here. There's a report on how to keep increasing LGBTQ access to shelter, and really the ways that improving privacy can support multiplicity of genders and also be supportive to people with disabilities, to families, in some really innovative ways. And there's some very cool models of reconfiguring shelter to meet the needs of more people. I mentioned the National Queer Asian and Pacific Islander Association's campaign, Family is Still Family, which, as you can see here, is available in a number of languages. I believe they're also building it out to include even more. Another report from the National Institute on LGBTQ domestic violence called Advocacy with Friends and Family to Support LGBTQ Survivors of Abuse, which really focuses on, I think, this fact that people are naming that often LGBTQ people don't seek services from culturally specific programs and instead turn to networks of friends and family in order to seek support, which can sometimes be helpful and can often be not very helpful, but really from the seat of community-based programs, how can we work to improve the responses that friends and family have rather than needing to be able to meet all of the needs through our programs ourselves. And then a few more resources that I just want to lift up. And again, this is a partial list, but some particularly helpful ones, I think. Blueprint for Increasing LGBTQ Access to DV Advocacy, which is called Creating the Conditions for Change. I definitely recommend checking that out if you're considering how to do an organizational audit or upgrade of policies and practices. The API Institute's library on gender-based violence and specifically on LGBTQ GBV. And then finally, the Creative Interventions Toolkit on community-based responses to violence is just a wonderful resource that really speaks in many ways to how we develop community responses that meet the needs of all community members. So just as we approach our time here, maybe we can go to the final slide. I just want to name that almost all, not quite all, but almost all of the art in the presentation is by LGBTQ API artists. And I've included credits on all the slides. So when the slides go out, please do feel free to check out their work and support those artists. And then if you have questions or anything in today's presentation left you hoping for additional resources, or if there's a particular situation or question that you're wanting some support with, please feel free to reach out. We do want to make sure that we're just making an easy bridge for you all to get training support and technical assistance as it's useful. But thanks so much for joining. Feel free to add any final comments or questions into the chat and we can respond to them in the follow-up email, but glad to have you with us and really look forward to continuing the conversation as appropriate, and thank you for the work you do.
Thank you so much, Nathan. And I know there were some questions around, we really appreciated the graphic that you created or sharing during the webinar. There were some questions around whether or not they will be able to use that graphic in their own trainings. And you and I can talk, Nathan, we can share it with folks afterwards. I just want to say it's so meaningful and so important to have, for me, to have this opportunity to kind of step back and think critically about the assumptions and norms that we're operating out of on a daily basis, and at times even complicit in ourselves. It's just such a needed conversation, and it doesn't happen enough, right? And it doesn't happen in enough spaces. And so I love learning from advocates like Nathan about how our work in particular at the Institute can be better, can be more inclusive, and how we can dismantle our own patriarchal behaviors, our own heteronormative behaviors. So just thank you so much. And thank you, of course, to all the attendees here today for being here and for being interested. There is a couple of outstanding questions that we will try to address later on, and as Nathan said, his email is on the screen here, and I'm sure you all have my email, so feel free to reach out at any time. Thank you so much.
Thanks all, take care.
Take care.